The Generate tab is going to allow you to control how the hairs are created at render time. The first checkbox, Render Hairs, is simply going to be like an enable or disable switch for your hairs. Currently, if I render, you'll see that the hairs render just fine. If I uncheck Render Hairs and render again, we don't get anything in the viewport. Turning Render Hairs back on, we can check out the type. And the type is very similar to whatever we saw in the Editor tab here. Now, to see the results from this, you are going to have to make sure that the Generate is set to as Render in the Editor tab. Having it set to None is just going to give you a display of the hair as it would render. Setting it to Spline, it's going to display the hair as splines. So this is more or less like what you would see when you're using the hair lines option in the Editor tab. The one thing with spline, though, is if you try to render, it's not going to render anything, because all it's creating is a spline. In this case, you would have to use it in conjunction with something like a sweep NURBS. Then if you render, you can see that it's rendering the hair as a swept object. The next option is flat, and this is the same as the flat option in the viewport. Triangle, same thing again, and square. There are a couple more options added, such as circle, and this one just gives you a circular base for the hair object. And again, this is going to affect the render, so for each one of these, it will render like this. It's not just how it displays in the viewport. There's also an option for instance. What instance is going to allow you to do is take some sort of source geometry and have that be applied to your hairs. Now, through the magic of editing, we have a little flower in our scene here. And there are a couple things to note about what we are going to be using as the instance. First off, it's a polygon object. So this is going to be important because the instance that you can connect in here is really only going to want to work with polygon objects. It doesn't want primitives and it doesn't want generators or anything like that. The next thing that is important with your geometry here is where the axis is on your object. So you can see this is actually a little bit below the pelt. But what I've done is I've made sure to align the axis with the base of this flower, because the axis here is where the flower is going to be set at the beginning of the root. So we'll click on the hair object, and then we're going to drag the flower into the object link field for the instance dropdown. As soon as I do that, you can see that we get some sort of feedback in the viewport. If we zoom out, you'll see that there are lots of little lines with these kind of little lumps on them. The reason we see these little lumps is because of the scaling here. If we take a look at this menu, you have three options. There's Uniform, Keep Aspect, and Fit. Now, anytime you're dealing with the scaling, you're also going to be dealing with the thickness in the hair material. So if we open the hair material up, you'll see that we have the thickness parameter. And in here you have options for the root and the tip. Now these two values here are actually going to drive the scale of your instance. If we go to the root and set this to a value of 1.5, you'll see that we can start seeing something that looks more like a flower. Now generally when you are working with these values, you're probably going to want to have the instance more or less maintain the original shape of the geometry. And in that case, you want to make sure that the root and tip values are the same. Let's go back to the hair object. You'll see with Uniform that it hasn't changed a whole lot. But what I can do is adjust the size of the root, and things get really skinny. If I adjust the size of the tip to something that's close again, you'll see that the flower comes back, but it doesn't really grow any larger, and it isn't really skewed at all. So it's trying to maintain the uniform scale of the instance object itself. If we go to something like Keep Aspect, you'll see that the actual object is huge now. And that's because with Keep Aspect, what it's trying to do is maintain the original height of your geometry, but then it's taking the width and it's taking the depth of those, and it's stretching them to whatever value you have set in the thickness here. Next, you have Fit. And Fit is going to give you more or less the exact same thing as the Keep Aspect. So really, when you're choosing between these options, just find the one that gives you the result you're looking for, and that's going to be the one that works for you. So in our case, we'll stick with Keep Aspect with 3 inches by 3 inches. And maybe that's a little bit too big, so we'll just go 1.5 by 1.5. There's also an axis dropdown, and this is going to allow you to choose which axis from your instance is going to be aligned with the hair. So in our case, If we take a look at the null object again, let's just move this up and out a little bit. We have the axis at the base of the hair, and it is aligned with the y-axis here. So if we go back to the hair object and look at the axis, it's also set to y. So this is saying that the y-axis of the instance will be aligned to the hair. If I set this to x, you'll see that all of my flowers are being pulled out along their x-axis. And the z-axis is going to give us pretty much the same thing because the hair, or our instance object, is actually more or less symmetrical on the x and z axis. So for this particular object, the y-axis is really the only choice that we have. We then have a dropdown that's going to allow us to define how the instance is going to be affected by a guide that is not necessarily straight. So by setting deform to none, what happens is it's stripping off all of the information that was being passed along to our flower from the hair material. If we set deform to align, what it's doing is it's simply looking at the tip and the root of the hair, and it's aligning the instance to those 2 points. So if we go into simulation, choose hair tools, and find something like the brush, and then brush some of these shapes, you'll see that it's not actually bending the stalks of the flowers or the flower itself. It's simply taking those directions now as a guide for where the root and tip should be pointing. If we go back to the hair object and set this to bend, now we have the actual instance objects, or in this case our flowers, bending along with the hairs. We next have a drop-down for hierarchy, and at the moment we don't have a hierarchy, so let's go ahead and create one. We'll select our flower, and maybe let's just name this flower for safekeeping here, and then we'll create a duplicate of it. Maybe what I also want to do is just quickly make a new texture here, and let's set this to white. And we'll apply this to the flower, or the second flower. So now we have a blue flower and a white flower. If we go back to the hair object, we're also going to click on the Keep Textures checkbox. So you'll see by default we're not really getting any texture on the objects at all, and if we click on Keep Textures, it's going to source whatever texture is applied to the instance object. So the hierarchy dropdown is now going to reference the objects that are in the instance object hierarchy. First is set to reference the flower itself. The next option is forward, and what forward is going to do is move forward through the list. So it's going to start at the first object and then go to the next object. Once it reaches the end, it would start over again. So why aren't we seeing any results in the viewport though? Well, that's because the hierarchy isn't actually going to look at the hierarchy and scatter those throughout all the hairs. It's actually going to distribute the objects along the hair. So we also have to use the repeat parameter. And if we increase this to 2, you'll see what we're getting now is a stack of flowers. So we have a blue flower and then a white flower. Or in this case, we have our first object and the second object. If we increase repeat, you'll see how it cycles. So now we have first again, and then second. Setting the hierarchy to reverse, you'll see that we get the reverse now. It's starting with the last object in the hierarchy and moving up the list, and then it's going to repeat afterwards. There's an option for cycle, and cycle looks exactly the same as forward, and the reason for that right now is just because we should throw in another object here. So again, we'll make a duplicate of the flower. Let's go ahead and give this one yellow petals. And we'll kind of adjust the view again. We'll go back to the hair object. So with it set to cycle, you'll see that it's now starting at the first object. It goes to the second object, finds the third object, and then goes back to the second. Given another chance to repeat, you'll see that it eventually gets back to the very first object. The next option is random. And it's just going to look at any random object in this instance hierarchy and place that somewhere along the hair. The nice thing about random is if I did want to have a whole bunch of different colored flowers but not want to have them stacked on top of each other, if I set my repeat down to 0, or in this case 1, you'll see that it's always going to choose a random object from that hierarchy. So now I get a nice distribution of randomly colored flowers. The final two options are the start and end sliders. And this is going to allow you to control where the object starts or ends on your hair. So by controlling the start, you can create an offset from the root of the hair. And by controlling the end, you can adjust how far along the hair the instance object will grow.